Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into something oddly specific. Not grand like a palace or mysterious like a lost tomb, but far more uncomfortable. We're stepping into the world of medieval dentistry, a place of cracked molars smoking herbs, and tools that look more like weapons than instruments. There are no anesthetics here, no gentle hands, just grit and hope. But tonight, we're not here to wince or flinch. We're here to float quietly through this world, to feel the chill of stone. Workshops to hear the clink of iron tongs, and to wonder how did anyone survive this. Won't look away, we'll simply observe and listen. It usually began with a knock-soft, hesitant echoing down a crooked village lane lined with damp stone and thatched roofs. The sort of knock that carried more fear than urgency. No one rushed to see the dentist in medieval times. They were not healers in the modern sense. They didn't wear white coats or work in clean tiled offices. Often they were barbers, blacksmiths, monks, or simply the only soul in the village with a steady hand and a strong stomach, the person on the other side. Of that knock was often hunched over, hand cupping a swollen jaw, red-rimmed eyes told of sleepless nights and constant pain. The kind that throbs with every heartbeat. In a world without ibuprofen, even a simple toothache could turn into a living nightmare lasting for weeks, months, or until the rot spread far enough to end the suffering. One way or another, dentistry in the medieval world wasn't a profession. It was more of a grim task that fell into the laps of people who were already used to dealing with discomfort. Your local barber, for instance, was far more than a man who trimmed beards. He could set bones, perform minor surgeries, pull teeth, and even drain boils. Their telltale sign, the red and white striped pole, stood for blood and bandages, not candy canes, and many a soul stumbled into their workshop, not for a fresh shave, but for the removal of something much worse. Let's pause here, not to judge or cringe, but to take in the setting. Imagine a small wooden stool sitting in the corner of a dark, smoky room. Tools hang from rusted nails hammered into the wall, pincers, hooks, chisels, even tongs that wouldn't look out of place in a butcher's shop. There are no clean gloves, no disinfectant, no delicate instruments of titanium and polished steel, just crude iron dull edges, and the heavy smell of sweat and old herbs. Patient would sit, sometimes tied down to prevent thrashing, sometimes held by family members, whose grim expressions betrayed the pain they themselves had once endured. The barber, surgeon, or tooth drawer would prepare his tools with methodical slowness, not to be gentle, but because he knew the pain was coming, and that once it started, there was no turning back. If you had a rotting molar, the first step was identification. There were no x-rays, no precision, just a look inside the mouth with the naked eye. Maybe a metal pick to prod at the darkened tooth, sending a jolt of pain through the jaw. That reaction was often all the confirmation they needed. A jerk of the head, a scream, and the tool was selected. Tooth extraction was brutal. The goal was not elegance, but speed. The tooth key, a medieval tool with a clawed end, would be inserted into the mouth, hooked onto the offending tooth, and twisted sharply like opening a wine bottle. If done correctly, the tooth would come out in one piece. If not, well, splinters of bone and tooth might remain, leading to infection, or worse, no anesthesia, no numbing agents, just clove oil rubbed on the gums, or perhaps a swig of mead to dull the senses. Maybe a prayer, mumbled quickly by the patient or the operator. A few Hail Marys, and then snap, crack, scream. Still, for many, this agony was better than the slow grinding pain of living with a decaying tooth. Infections of the mouth could be deadly. Dental abscesses could swell into the neck, close the throat, or spread to the brain. The risk of death was real, and so was the fear. Some chose to live with the pain. Others took their chances with the tooth pullers. Neither option was good, but dentistry, even in the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, wasn't only about yanking teeth. There were attempts, however rudimentary, at prevention. The wealthy had access to early forms of mouthwash made with wine or vinegar, sometimes flavored with herbs. Monks copied ancient Greek and Roman medical texts that advised on dental hygiene, like using powders made of crushed mint salt or even burnt bread. These powders were rubbed on the teeth with cloth or fingers. Toothpicks carved from bone or wood were common across all classes. Some of these methods were surprisingly effective, others not so much. For instance, a popular belief held that worms caused toothaches. These so-called tooth worms were thought to burrow into the gums and nest in the roots. Treatments to kill them ranged from the mildly odd, like holding hot cabbage leaves against your face, to the outright dangerous, like dripping poisonous concoctions directly into the mouth. Even so, there was a sense of community to the pain. Everyone from peasant to lord suffered from tooth decay. Eventually, sugar was rare, but diets rich in coarse-bred beer and root vegetables wore down teeth quickly. There was no escaping it. A child's laughter could be interrupted by a scream of sudden pain. A laborer might collapse in the fields with swelling in the face. A knight might ride into battle with an infected jaw. We picture the Middle Ages as violent, full of swords and blood. But for many, the real enemy wasn't outside the castle. It was the silent agony inside their own skull. As night falls around this memory, we begin to understand. Being a dentist in the medieval world wasn't a calling. It was a necessity, a shadowy duty in a world full of suffering. No one wanted to do it, but someone had to. And so, with a steady hand, a rusted tool, and perhaps a whispered apology, the work began. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, a man sharpens his blade, not for battle, but for the grim task of tending to a festering mouth. His workshop smells of iron sweat and herbs left too long in a damp jar. Outside the village breathes its usual rhythm. Livestock stir in their pens, wind whistles through the trees, and far in the distance, a church bell tolls inside, though a very different ritual is about to unfold. This man is a barber surgeon, a title that straddles medicine and madness. In medieval Europe, trained physicians were rare and prohibitively expensive. For the average person, medical care was a jigsaw puzzle of folk remedies, religious intervention, and people like this man, a jack of all trades with access to sharp tools, and the nerve to use them. Barber surgeons weren't just dentists. They cut hair, stitched wounds, lanced boils, and occasionally performed amputations. Their education was often practical, handed down through apprenticeships, trial, and more often than not, error. Dentistry in their hands became an act of controlled violence. If they were lucky, let's imagine a patient arriving at this shop. His name might be something like Thomas, a tenant farmer in his mid-30s, though he looks closer to 50. His face is bloated on one side, his speech is slurred, and his shirt is wet with drool and blood. He hasn't slept in days. His children, watching him moan at the hearth, begged his wife to do something, and so she did. She sent him to the barber. The room is dark, but not cold. A fire crackles on the hearth, heating a pot of water. On a rough-hewn table lies a set of tools, a small hammer, forceps, a spoon-shaped probe, and the dreaded tooth key, the crown jewel of medieval dentistry. It's a heavy, awkward tool with a clawed end and a long wooden handle. When placed over a tooth and turned with force, it can ideally pry the tooth out in one piece. Ideally. Before Thomas sits, he's offered a cloth soaked in wine, sometimes mixed with crushed poppy or belladonna, if the barber has access to such herbs. But this isn't anesthesia. It's more of a numbing hope, something to dull the edge of panic. There's no sterilization, no masks. The barber might wipe his hands on his apron stain from the last task and give a short nod. That's the signal. It's time. Tooth key is placed in the mouth. The barber mutters something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a warning. Then he turns one quick, brutal motion. Thomas screams. There is no gentle pulling, no finesse. The tool crushes surrounding gum tissue. If the tooth breaks, the barber digs out fragments with the spoon-ended probe. The whole process might take 5 minutes or 40. Sometimes it ends in triumph of full extraction. Sometimes it ends with the patient fainting, bleeding, or worse. But in many cases, the pain that followed was less than the pain they arrived with. And in that strange arithmetic, it was considered a success these barber surgeons didn't operate in isolation. In larger towns, they formed guilds, brotherhoods of practice, where members shared techniques, secrets, and sometimes apprentices. In London, the Company of Barber Surgeons was officially chartered in 1540, merging two previously separate trades. Their symbol, often a pole with red and white stripes, was a familiar sight outside shops. The red represented blood. The white bandages spinning poles outside the doors were literal wind-dried cloths, twisted and displayed to advertise their services. For all their skill and necessity, these men existed on the fringes of respectability. Real physicians trained at universities like Paris or Bologna looked down upon them. They considered barber surgeons crude, unlettered, and far too bloody. But few physicians ever touched a tooth that was beneath them. So the work fell, as always, to the ones willing to do what others wouldn't. Should pause here, not just to appreciate their courage, but to acknowledge the cost. Many barber surgeons died young, not from violence, but from infection, mercury exposure, or constant inhalation of rot and decay. There were no rubber gloves, no face coverings. Every tooth they pulled was a risk each. One a gamble with pus blood and unseen bacteria sometimes. They made mistakes. Sometimes they removed the wrong tooth. Sometimes they fractured jaws. Occasionally, patients died from blood loss or infection. But the harsh truth of the time was this: doing nothing was usually worst. Dentistry wasn't the only service they provided. Some barbers offered cures for bad breath, which they believed to be caused by stomach vapors or humors gone sour. Treatments included chewing dried sage, gargling with vinegar and salt, or even sniffing burned rosemary. While some of these worked mildly, they were chasing symptoms, never the true cause. The theories guiding their work were rooted in the humoral system, a medical belief dating back to ancient Greece. It claimed the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness occurred when these were out of balance. Toothaches, in this view, could be caused by too much heat in the blood or a chill in the phlegm. Treatments therefore included not just pulling teeth, but bleeding, the patient applying leeches or prescribing purgatives to realign the humors. And yet, despite these strange beliefs, progress crept in slowly. In Italy, Arabic and Greek medical texts were being translated and studied. In monasteries, monks copied centuries-old manuscripts that discussed hygiene, diet, and even rudimentary dental care. In cities like Paris, some forward-thinking practitioners began using gold wire to fasten loose teeth. Crude bridges made of animal bone or carved ivory were fashioned for nobles who could afford them, but those were rare luxuries. For the common man, the reality was always the same. Wait until the pain becomes unbearable, then walk no stagger to the man with the knives, and hope he doesn't slip as we leave this chapter. The light in the barber's shop dims. The bloodied rag is dropped into a bucket. The tooth, still warm, rests on a wooden tray. Thomas lies slumped in the chair, exhausted, breathing shallow, but easier than before. Outside, the wind carries the sound of hooves on mud. Another visitor approaches another pane, another chapter in the long, aching story of medieval dentistry. Before the rise of barber surgeons in every town square, and before dental tools began resembling instruments of war, there was another kind of healer, quieter, cloaked in robes, and often hidden behind monastery walls. The medieval monk, in many ways, was Europe's first organized dentist, not by title, but by necessity. You see, monasteries were among the few places in the medieval world where reading, writing, and recording were taken seriously. While kingdoms rose and fell, and cities earned, monks preserved what they could of the classical world texts from Hippocrates, Galen, and later, Arabic scholars like Avicenna. In these dusty volumes were clues about the body, including the mysterious workings of the mouth. Imagine the scriptorium long. Wooden tables under slanted windows, shafts of light falling across open pages and rows of ink pots. One monk copies scripture, another a medical text, painstakingly translating it into Latin, one ink-stained letter at a time. Somewhere in those fragile pages lies a line about pain of the tooth, and how one might relieve it using a poultice of herbs and crushed minerals. Monks didn't pull teeth with iron claws. Their world was more about herbal remedies, prayers and tonics ground by hand in stone mortar, and yet many villagers and even nobles would seek them out first before enduring the agony of a barber's bench. Let's pause for a moment. Step into a monastic infirmary. It's quiet, always quiet. Candles flicker on stone. Ledges, a faint smell of lavender, rosemary, and something earthier, perhaps. Myrrh hangs in the air. A patient lies on a straw mattress, one cheek swollen like a ripened plum. A monk in brown robes and a rope belt moves silently through the room. He holds a wooden bowl of steaming water and a cloth soaked in chamomile and sage. His approach is gentle. He speaks little, if at all. This is a place of healing, not chatter. Rather than pulling the tooth immediately, the monk prepares a poultice, a thick paste made from mashed garlic wine vinegar and crushed cloves. Garlic, even then, was known for its antiseptic properties. Clove, imported from the East, was rare, but powerful. Its oil could dull the nerves when applied directly to the gums. The mixture is wrapped in linen and pressed gently against the aching jaw. This was no miracle. The pain would not vanish, but for many, it brought enough relief to avoid extraction. Altogether, monks also offered mouth rinses made with mint sage or vinegar. These were among the earliest attempts at oral hygiene, not because they understood bacteria, but because texts from earlier ages suggested their value. Cleanliness, after all, was seen as a spiritual virtue, even if monks bathed less than. We might imagine. Interestingly, some monastic texts contain recipes for tooth powders, early forms of toothpaste. One such powder might include crushed sage leaves, burned rosemary ash, salt, powdered oyster shells. These ingredients were mixed and rubbed onto teeth using a cloth or even a frayed twig. While abrasive and lacking fluoride, this was still a far cry, better than doing nothing. Yet, monks were not immune to the more superstitious currents of the time. Some believed toothaches were caused by sins or even demonic forces. A chronic ache might warrant confession, fasting, or even flagellation, punishing the flesh to drive out the spiritual rot. Others invoked saints for healing, particularly Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry. According to legend, Saint Apollonia had all her teeth violently pulled out during her martyrdom in the 3rd century. By the Middle Ages, she had become the one to pray to when molars burned or incisors throbbed. Her image often holding a golden tooth with pincers adorned chapels, pendants, and tiny carved relics that some would clutch during moments of unbearable pain, and so treatment was layered, a poultice to the jaw, a prayer to Apollonia, perhaps a confession whispered through clenched teeth. Sometimes, even a pilgrimage, walking barefoot to a nearby shrine in the hopes of a cure. It's easy to look back and scoff, but in a world without x-rays, without dental schools, without a concept of bacteria, faith was often the only comfort. There were moments of brilliance too. Some monastic texts describe draining abscesses with a hot needle, followed by repeated cleansing with herbal rinses. Others include instructions for cauterizing infected gums, a painful but sometimes life-saving act. The monks, unlike many others, had access to consistent tools, learned colleagues, and above all time. In an age when most lives were consumed by survival, monks had the luxury of learning still. Not all monasteries offered help equally. Some orders, like the Benedictines, were known for their healing practices. Others focused purely on spiritual labor. Access to their care depended on your status, your location, and whether or not they believed your suffering was physical or divine punishment in disguise. Let's return to that monk now cleaning his mortar and pestle. He places his herbs back on the shelf, washes his hands with cold rainwater, and kneels beside a candle to read. The patient sleeps not deeply, but better than before. Outside, the wind howls. Across the cloister, pushing at the wooden shutter's pane, is not gone, but it has been softened, dimmed. Just enough for rest to take hold. In this calm moment we realize there was dignity in this form of care. A softness the barber surgeons couldn't afford, a slowness the outside world didn't allow. These monks hidden away in stone walls didn't just preserve knowledge, they preserved compassion. In a world ruled by iron and fire, they offered something gentler, not painless, but merciful. And so while others pulled and bled and burned, the monks healed with herbs, silence, and slow hands. A different kind of dentistry, one that asked not only where it hurts, but why. Let's leave behind the monastery for now. Step out from its hushed corridors and quiet herb-scented rooms. Step back into the chaos of the common world, where reason often gave way to fear, and where pain, especially pain in the teeth, was something more than physical. It was mystical, punishing, unexplainable. In the medieval imagination, toothaches weren't just infections or inflammation. They were omens, curses, or most famously, Wormsey's tooth worms. It might sound strange now, but for centuries, people across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East genuinely believed that tiny worms lived inside decaying teeth. If your tooth ached, throbbed, or oozed, it wasn't because of bacteria hadn't been discovered yet. No, it was because some sinister little creature had bored its way inside and was feasting on your nerves from the inside out. In a way, this theory made sense. Think about it, many decayed teeth developed visible black holes or pits. Some patients said they could feel something wriggling, squirming deep within the tooth. Dentists who pulled a rotten molar might see pus or soft tissue that resembled a curled white worm. And in an era without microscopes, without germ theory, and without understanding of dental pulp or infection, the mind filled in the blanks. These worms became villains whispered about in taverns and around fireplaces. They were blamed for sudden pain, swelling, even dreams of biting or being bitten. And naturally, people sought ways to kill them. One method involved fumigation, a form of smoke therapy. A person suffering from toothache would sit with their mouth open over a small fire or heated stone. Dried herbs, often henbane or belladonna, were placed on the fire. As the smoke rose, the sufferer would allow it to drift into their mouth, the goal to suffocate the worm. Afterwards, some reported feeling better. Maybe the herbs had a numbing effect. Maybe the warmth increased blood flow and reduced swelling. Or maybe the belief in relief was strong enough to work on its own. Other methods were even stranger. Some healers would take a small piece of wool soaked in oil or vinegar and place it in the cavity of the tooth, believing it would lure the worm. In extreme cases, patients were advised to sleep with a dead mouse tied to the side of their jaw, the belief being that the pain would transfer from the tooth to the rodent. Of course, it never did. Toothaches were also deeply tied to celestial and supernatural forces. The phases of the moon, the alignment of the stars, these were all thought to influence bodily health. There were even medieval dental calendars that advised when was the safest time to extract a tooth. Pull it under the wrong moon phase, and the wound might never stop bleeding. Pull it when Mercury was in the wrong house, and you risked madness or infection. Astrology was not just entertainment, it was embedded in medical practice. A patient suffering from a toothache might be asked, "What hour were you born? What did the moon look like last night?" The barber surgeon might check his zodiac man, a diagram that mapped the human body onto astrological signs to determine whether the stars favored extraction. Let's pause and imagine the moment you're sitting on a stool, mouth open, jaw burning, and the man holding a pair of iron tongs is checking the position of the planets. Not because he doubts your pain, but because he fears your death. More other toothache cures were steeped In folk magic, one English charm from the 13th century instructed sufferers to say aloud, "Outworm with 9 worms, and all from the marrow to the skin, go out, go out." This was often whispered while holding a piece of iron or spitting into running. Water symbols of power and cleansing. Another practice was to write certain holy words or magical symbols on parchment, roll them tightly, and wear them as a pendant near the aching tooth. These charms blended Christian prayers with pagan symbols, showing how tangled belief systems were at the time. A person might pray to Saint Apollonia in the morning, burn henbane at noon, and recite a toothworm charm by moonlight. All in the same day. Children were not spared from this world of superstitions. In many villages, baby teeth were treated with both reverence and fear. If you dropped a tooth on the floor, it was said that mice might take it and replace your adult teeth with weak, rodent-like ones. To avoid this fate, parents would burn the tooth or bury it in secret places, often near the family hearth. In Scandinavia, some believe that burying a tooth in the garden would keep the child's future teeth strong and straight. But perhaps the most enduring superstition of all was that pain itself was punishment. Some believed that those who suffered from toothaches had gossiped, lied, or spoken ill of others. The pain then was justice sent by God to punish the sinful mouth. This belief was most common among strict religious communities, where self-blame was a powerful form of control. Some even refused treatment, entirely choosing to repent instead of extract. Better to suffer in silence, they thought, than to anger heaven further. These ideas, strange as they are, remind us of one simple truth. When we can't explain suffering, we invent meaning. We wrap pain in story. We give it shape, face, voice. Even worms back in the present, we sit with these whispers. Not to laugh, not to mock, but to understand, to see the world, not just through science, but through fear and faith, through the long sleepless nights of peasants and kings alike, and through the soft prayers of those desperate for relief. Next time you feel a twinge in your jaw, remember, there was a time when it meant much more than a trip to the dentist. It meant spirits, stars, smoke, and worms. It meant choices between the strange and the painful, between faith and fire. And sometimes, just sometimes, it meant hope. We often imagine medieval peasants as the primary victims of dental misery, faces swollen, teeth blackened, and options few. And while it's true that the poor suffered immensely, the upper classes were not exempt from the agony of the tooth. In fact, in many ways, their wealth made it worse. Welcome to the world of medieval nobility, where golden goblets overflowed with sweetened wines. Banquet tables groaned beneath roasted meats and spiced pastries, and smiling courtiers showed off. Teeth rotting behind pearls and velvet. Let's start with a myth. Wealth equals better health in the medieval world. That wasn't necessarily true. Nobles had access to foods and luxuries the poor could never dream of. But many of these luxuries were awful for teeth. Refined flours, sticky fruits preserved in honey, imported sugars from the East. These treats were abrasive, acidic, and clingy. Unlike peasants, who mostly ate coarse breads and root vegetables, the nobility consumed very ingredients that accelerated decay. Imagine a feast at a nobleman's hall. The room is lit by candlelight, reflecting off polished silver plates. Arrive in waves meats, cooked in sweet sauces. Jellies thickened with dates, sugar-dusted fritters, candied almonds, mulled wine. Every bite an indulgence, every bite a silent attack on the enamel. Yet, those at the table had no idea. They didn't brush nut like we do today. At best, they might rinse with wine, chew on fennel or mint, or scrub with a rag and crushed seashells. But their glowing skin and fine clothing often concealed aching mouths, swollen gums, and breath that betrayed silent suffering. So what did the wealthy do when the pain struck? They didn't visit the local barber surgeon, at least, not unless it was an emergency. Instead, they called upon private physicians, or if they were very fortunate, court apothecaries and specialist tooth drawers who served the elite. These early dentists offered a range of treatments, often mixing genuine herbal knowledge with a generous dose of spectacle and superstition. They came dressed finely, carrying elegant boxes filled with tools and vials. They might travel long distances to attend to a countess's aching molar or a prince's infected canine pain management. Of course, was still primitive, but the wealthy could afford imported ingredients: clove oil, opium-based tinctures, rare eastern spices like cardamom and cinnamon that were believed to chase away evil humors and soothe the nerves. Some physicians applied leeches behind the ears, believing that drawing blood away from the head could relieve pressure in the mouth for swelling. The favored cure was a hot poultice of mustard seed and vinegar, wrapped in cloth and pressed to the cheek for gum. Disease, some noblewomen rinsed with mixtures of honey, salt, and sage, a routine passed down by generations of household herbalists. These practices had some merit, but they were no match for sugar and thyme. Sometimes nobles insisted on saving the tooth, especially front teeth, which mattered for smiling, for courtship, for status. This gave rise to an early form of dental cosmetology. Some had rotting teeth filed down to make them appear straighter. Others used gold wire to tie loose teeth in place if a tooth fell out completely. Wealthier individuals might commission prosthetics carved from ivory, bone, or even human teeth sourced from soldiers, criminals, or the dead. These false teeth were held in place with thread or paste. They weren't functional, but they looked convincing enough to pass at a distance. And in the courtly world of appearances, that was often more important, and comfort. Royalty in particular took extreme measures. Historical records suggest that Queen Elizabeth I, though slightly beyond the medieval period, suffered from famously bad teeth. Blackened by sugar and decay, she wore layers of makeup to hide swelling and kept her mouth mostly closed in portraits. Earlier monarchs were no better off. French kings, known for their lavish banquets, often had missing teeth by midlife. One chronicler described a nobleman who smiled like a battlefield, half the line already fallen. But if the nobility suffered so openly, why didn't dental care improve faster? The answer lies in pride and power to admit to illness, especially one so visible and base as a toothache was to show weakness. Many aristocrats hid their pain, refusing treatment until absolutely necessary. Others insisted on exotic cures or magical amulets, convinced that their bloodline was too pure for common medicine. They saw dentistry as something for the poor, the dirty, the desperate, not realizing that their diets and vanity placed them at even greater risk. And when extractions became unavoidable, they were performed in private chambers, away from curious eyes. Servants were sworn to silence. Physicians offered opiates if available, or numbing herbs mixed with wine. The screaming was muffled behind tapestries. Let's imagine such a moment. A nobleman, cloaked in fur, sits on a velvet chair. A physician kneels before him, candlelight gleaming off a small silver tool. A servant holds a basin. Another dabs the nobleman's brow outside. Music plays for the guests inside. The physician twists, pulls, and prays. It was brutal. Always, but the nobleman would emerge hours later, pale, maybe trembling, but with a silk scarf draped artfully around his jaw. At dinner, no one would mention it. No one would dare. And what about the noblewomen? Their suffering was often silent and even more hidden. A lady of the court might cover her mouth with a fan, or avoid speaking too much if her teeth had become noticeably decayed. Remedies for them were even more delicate: potions masked in perfume, tinctures in crystal bottles, clove-stuffed sachets to hold gently between the gums and cheek. But when the pain became unbearable, their treatment was the same as anyone else's: tooth pulled, blood spilled, dignity tested. Elite may have lived in castles and dined off gold, but when it came to dental pain, they were just as vulnerable, perhaps even more so. And perhaps that is one of the rare equalizers of the medieval world. Whether you were born in a hut or crowned in a cathedral, your teeth could betray you. Rot did not care about bloodlines. Infection did not ask your title, and no amount of coin could guarantee a painless night. As we close this chapter, picture a noble's chamber in the early morning. The fire has burned low, the tools are clean, the blood wiped away. The Lord sleeps, mouth open, one tooth fewer, and dreams of something soft, something far away from the bone-deep pain he knew just hours before. Even for the mighty, rest was a fragile, hard-won thing, and the world of dentistry, hidden behind silk curtains and gold thread, was no less brutal, just better dressed. It's early morning, and the village square is already waking. Traders unfold their canvas stalls, chickens squawk in wicker cages. The smell of baked bread and manure mingles in the cool breeze, but tucked among the vendors selling turnips, cloth, and salted fish is something else. A small raised platform, a stool, a wooden bucket, a few tools gleaming in the sun, and standing beside them, sleeves rolled up, an apron already stained red, is the tooth drawer. This isn't a clinic. There are no appointments, no privacy, just a bustling public spectacle where dental care meets street performance. In medieval Europe, especially in towns and traveling fairs, dentistry was often practiced out in the open by those who had little medical training, but a strong stomach and a flair for drama. These were the itinerant tooth pullers, roaming practitioners who treated pain not with subtlety, but with speed and noise. Let us imagine the scene more clearly. A man climbs onto the platform and begins to shout, his voice ringing above the market din. He boasts of his talent, his experience, his tools from Paris, and his miraculous results. He may have no formal medical education, but he has stories. He waves a pouch filled with teeth he's pulled. He gestures to a crude sign hanging above his stall, painted with a bloody tooth, sometimes crossed with a sword or snake. It's part medicine, part menace. People gather, out of curiosity, out of boredom, or out of need. Someone in the crowd steps forward. Woman clutching her jaw, cheeks pale and drawn. She's been in pain for days, maybe weeks, and today it ends. Tooth drawer beckons her to sit. There's no privacy curtain, no shielding from the crowd. The tools are basic iron forceps, a tooth key, a scalpel for lancing infected gums, sometimes a wedge of wood to keep the mouth open. If she's lucky, he offers a cup of wine. If not, he simply grips her jaw, steadies her head, and begins. There is screaming. Always some people faint, others cheer. Why such a public display? Because in a world where medicine was mysterious and suspect, spectacle built trust. If people could watch others get treated, see their pain cured in real time, they were more likely to believe in the practitioner's power. It was marketing, raw, bloody, and effective. Of course, not all tooth drawers were created equal. Some were surprisingly skilled. They learned from experience, hundreds of extractions techniques, passed down from their fathers or mentors. They developed instincts, how to judge which teeth could be saved, which had to go, and how to remove them cleanly. A few even kept herbs for post-treatment. Care sage for cleansing, garlic for infection, poppy for pain. Others, there were charlatans, quacks, who had no business holding a pair of forceps. They pulled the wrong teeth, they broke jaws. They left people worse than before and vanished before dawning. Some towns' local laws attempted to regulate these wandering dentists' records from certain medieval cities mentioned fines for false claims of medical ability or penalties for selling remedies with no known cure. But enforcement was rare. Most towns had bigger problems. Plague, theft, famine. A toothache, even one that ended badly, didn't rank very high-end, so these street-side dentists thrived. Some traveled with musicians who played loud tunes to drown out the screams. Others employed assistants to hand out herbal tooth powders or miracle salves after each extraction. The crowd loved it. Children watched wide-eyed. Adults clapped when the tooth came out cleanly. It was part healing, part theater, a strange dance of pain and applause. You might think no one would subject themselves to this. But remember, the alternative was worse. A rotten tooth didn't just ache. It ruined sleep, made eating impossible, sometimes swelled into abscesses that pressed on the throat or eyes. In rare cases, untreated infection spread through the blood, causing sepsis. People died. So when the tooth drawer came to town, he brought relief, crude, painful, but immediate. And for many, it was worth the risk. Let's revisit the woman we saw earlier. Her tooth is gone now, left behind in a small pile beside the platform. Blood drips from her mouth onto her collar. She's dizzy, shaken, but the throbbing is gone. That terrible nerve deep burn that had haunted her sleep for nights has lifted the pain. In its place is sharp, raw, but cleaner somehow. Finite, the tooth drawer gives her a cloth, maybe a nod, maybe a prayer. Then he turns back to the crowd. Another man steps forward. In some towns, the tooth puller stayed for days. In others, just hours. He slept above stables or under carts. He rarely kept records. His patients had no charts, no histories, only mouths full of pain and desperate hope. And then, like a storm, he was gone, off to the next village, the next aching mouth, the next performance there. Something eerie about these figures. These early street dentists, not quite doctors, not quite. Entertainers floating somewhere in between. They were both feared and needed, loathed and welcomed. They brought pain, but they also removed it. And that contradiction made them part of the fabric of daily life, especially for those who could afford nothing else. As the sun begins to lower over the marketplace, the last patient of the day steps away from the platform, mouth packed with a blood-soaked rag. The crowd disperses. The tooth drawer packs his tools, wipes his hands, stuffs another handful of extracted teeth into his pouch, like a hunter collecting trophies. Chickens are quieter now. The bread sellers are gone. But the memory lingers. The smell of iron and herbs, the sound of bone cracking in a crowded square. A memory carried not in books, but in the gaps left behind. Let's walk into the toolkit. It rests in a wooden box, scarred, splintered, and stained by time. There's no velvet lining, no polished brass clasps, no sense of delicate precision. Just iron, cold, heavy, and unforgiving. These are the tools of a medieval dentist, and they were as likely to cause damage as they were to cure pain. Dentistry in the Middle Ages didn't evolve in laboratories. It wasn't shaped by controlled experiments or scientific journals. It was forged in the open markets, behind monastery walls and on the battlefields. Teeth cracked beneath swords, and infected wounds became lethal. And the tools that emerged from this grim context reflected that world. Blunt, improvised, and terrifying. Let's start with the most infamous of them all, the tooth key. It looks like something you'd use to wind a massive clock or unlock a dungeon door, but its purpose was far more personal. The tooth key, also known as the dental key, was designed to extract molars with a twisting motion. It featured a long iron handle, a turning screw mechanism, and a curved claw that latched onto the base of the tooth. Here's how it worked. The claw would be jammed between the gum, and the tooth tightened with a few loud clicks, and then twisted hard. The idea was that the tooth would loosen and pop free like a cork from a bottle. That was the idea. Practice. The tooth key often fractured teeth, tore gums, and broke parts of the jawbone. If the dentist's grip was wrong, or the patient moved, the claw could rip through soft tissue. But despite its brutality, it remained in use for centuries. Why? Because it was faster than older methods. In a world without painkillers, speed was mercy. Next, we find dental pelicans, named for their resemblance to a pelican's beak. These tools were used to lever teeth from the socket. They had a curved jaw that hugged the tooth and a flat backing piece that rested against the jawbone. Pressure would be applied. Slow, controlled leverage that, when done right, could lift a tooth cleanly. But again, done right, depended heavily on experience. An amateur might apply force, unevenly crushing the tooth inward or snapping the root. The result, weeks of infection or worse. Then there were simple forceps, a more familiar sight. These looked like crude pliers and were used for grabbing and yanking. No finesse, no subtlety, just a strong grip and a quick pull. They were probably the most commonly used tool across Europe, especially by local barbers, monks, or blacksmiths who took up dentistry as a side trade. Now picture this: a bench, a small stool, a cloth to bite down on, and these tools laid out like instruments in a torture chamber. There was no sanitation, no antiseptics, no gloves. Tools were often wiped on aprons, rinsed in cold water, or not cleaned at all. Rust was common, and if a patient's gums were already bleeding, the risk of infection skyrocketed. Bloodborne diseases could be passed from one person to the next without anyone realizing. But even if the tool was clean, the real danger came after the tooth was removed, because behind all these instruments loomed an even darker reality. The lack of understanding about infection germs were not yet a known concept. The idea of miasma or bad air dominated theories of disease. If an infection took hold after a procedure, it was often blamed on the patient's humors or spiritual failings. Treatment might involve bloodletting or applying poultices of dung and herbs, sometimes honey. Or wine was used to cleanse a wound, but this was more a ritual than a reliable method. Let's return to the toolkit. There were also scrapers, thin iron rods with jagged ends, used to clean out cavities or chip away decayed enamel. The process was loud and painful. Patients would grip the arms of the chair, bite their tongues, or scream. Some passed out mid-procedure. Others were tied down to prevent flailing. And then there were files, tiny metal rasps used to flatten down jagged tooth edges, or even reduce the height of certain teeth, believed to be overgrown. Filing a living tooth without any anesthesia was excruciating. Imagine the slow grind of metal on bone, vibrations deep in the skull, the smell of scorched enamel, and the sharp, cold pain that reached into the jaw like a knife. The tools of hygiene, if we can call them that, were no better toothpicks, were made of bone wood or quills. Some were carved with ornamental tips and carried in pouches. Rich people used silver ones, dipped in oil or scented vinegar, but they were often reused, shared among family members or servants. No sterilization, no understanding of bacteria. Tooth powders were another crude attempt at hygiene, made of crushed eggshells, burnt rosemary powdered, charcoal, or even brick dust. These powders were rubbed onto teeth with cloth or fingers. Some added salt or vinegar to the mixture, hoping for a brighter smile or fresher breath. In reality, these powders were abrasive and often damaged the enamel, making teeth more vulnerable to decay. Now, if a dentist was particularly ambitious or unhinged, they might attempt surgical procedures. This could include lancing a dental abscess, usually with a heated knife chiseling out an embedded tooth fragment, or even attempting to drain an infection by cutting into the cheek. None of these practices were common, but they happened, and the mortality rate was not small for patients with money. Some traveling dentists carried their tools in leather kits lined with velvet or silk, not for hygiene, but for prestige. These were showpieces designed to impress wealthy patrons and promise a level of care that may or may not be delivered for the poor. However, the tools were whatever could be fashioned from iron and sharpened to a point. There's a strange duality in these instruments. They were symbols of healing, yet they looked like weapons. They were made to cure pain, but they often caused it first. In the hands of a skilled practitioner, they brought relief. In the hands of a fraud, they were instruments of torture, and they were not kept hidden in many homes. A tooth key or file might hang near the hearth, next to a bone saw or knife, part of the family's crude medical arsenal. Pain was a daily visitor. In medieval life, and teeth, more than anything, were a common source. So people kept the tools close, not because they wanted to use them, but because they knew eventually they would have to. The chapter closes. Let us imagine one final image: a small child watching his father have a tooth pulled. The man bites down on leather eyes, shut, knuckles white. The dentist reaches for the tooth key, fitting it like a wrench to a bolt. The child turns away, but the sound, the twist, the scream will echo for years And maybe one day, that child will inherit the very same toolkit. The iron, the rust, the cloth soaked in old stories, passed down from one mouth to the next. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: the sound of metal on metal, the distant ring of a bell, and the unmistakable scent of sweat, wood smoke, and old iron. You're standing outside a bustling, medieval barbershop, not a sleek salon with mirrors and magazines, but a smoky clattering stall with a worn bench, a weathered stool, and a man in a blood-stained apron waving you inside. Yes, barbers, not doctors, not priests, not surgeons. Barbers in the medieval world if you had a toothache. A barber might be your best option. Let's pull that thread a little during the Middle Ages. The division between professions wasn't as clearly defined as it is now. Specialization was rare. Most people had to wear many hats, and barbers in particular wore more than most, known formally as barber surgeons. They were a curious hybrid, part stylist, part surgeon, part dentist, and part bloodletter. They cut hair, they trimmed beards, but they also pulled teeth, set broken bones, lanced boils, performed amputations, and even conducted minor surgeries. Toolkits reflected this strange duality. Alongside combs and shears, you'd find scalpels, bone saws, hot irons, and of course the infamous tooth key. A medieval barber's stall was a place where beauty and blood lived side by side. Now step inside, there's no polished counter, no fragrant shaving cream or soft towels, just a bench, a chair, a bucket, and a few crude implements laid out on a cracked slab of wood. The barber stands with sleeves rolled high, his apron stiff from dried fluids, his hands blackened from soot and old blood. A man sits gripping the chair's arms. He has a rotting tooth. The swelling is visible from across the room. The barber doesn't ask many questions. He just nods, picks up a set of pliers, and begins. There are no appointments, no forms, no soothing music, just the quick flash of iron and the sound of teeth being torn from flesh. Why barbers? Why not real doctors? Well, here's the uncomfortable truth. Most real doctors didn't want anything to do with teeth in university-trained medical circles. Yes, those did exist. Dentistry was considered low, dirty, beneath the dignity of serious medicine. Learned physicians focused on humors, astrology, and long-winded theories about the liver and the brain. Teeth, that was work for tradesmen, so the job fell to barbers. They were already trusted in communities, already handling razors and knives. Adding tooth pulling to their list of services was more convenience than innovation. In some towns, the barber shop was the only medical stop available. Need a tooth out? Go see old Thomas down by the well. He'll sort you out for a few coins and a pint of ale. And while some barbers were surprisingly skilled, developing real talent through practice, others were frankly butchers, with no regulation, no licensing, and no true oversight. Results varied wildly. Let's talk about the barber pole for a moment. Oh, I've probably seen it. The red and white spiral design outside barbershops. It's still used today, though its origins are rooted in something far grimmer than haircuts. The red symbolizes blood, the white bandages, and the pole itself. That was the staff patients gripped during bloodletting or tooth extraction, something to squeeze while the pain took hold. Yes, that candy-striped icon was once a symbol of pain, blood, and the rough healing arts. And tooth extractions were often the bloodiest of all. There were no numbing agents, no sterile gauzes, just a quick prayer and a fast hand. In some barbershops, assistants would hold the patient down to prevent thrashing. In others, alcohol was administered beforehand, cheap wine or strong mead to dull the senses. But even then, the pain was overwhelming. Men cried, children screamed. Some fainted mid-procedure, others bolted halfway through it. Wasn't uncommon for barbers to chase patients down the street, pliers in hand, shouting, "You'll thank me later." And some did, because despite the horror of the moment, the agony of a rotting infected tooth could be worse than the extraction itself. It could last for weeks, drive a person mad with pain, even kill through systemic infection. For many, the barbarism of the barbershop was the lesser evil. Now, let's drift to another corner of this world, the traveling. Barber surgeon thieves were wandering practitioners, moving from village to village, setting up makeshift stalls in markets or town squares. They would call out to crowds boasting of their talents, teeth pulled in seconds. No pain, no danger, satisfaction guaranteed. They were part healer, part salesman, part entertainer sometimes. They performed public demonstrations. A brave or desperate soul would step forward, and the barber would remove a tooth in front of an audience, earning cheers, coins, or horrified gasps. If successful, it was a great advertisement. If something went wrong, well, there was always the next town. These traveling barbers carried small kits folding, knives, wooden clamps, hooks, forceps, and even powdered herbs to soothe the gums afterward. But cleanliness, rare. Their tools might be rinsed in a stream or wiped with a tunic. Disease spread easily, especially among those too poor to choose better. Care now imagine this. A young woman in a village has an infected molar. Her cheek is swollen. She hasn't slept in days. Her family has no money for a physician, if one even exists nearby. But a traveling barber has just arrived. His hands are calloused, his apron grimy, but his smile is reassuring. She agrees. She sits on a wooden stool in the middle of the market square. Children gather. An old man spits into the dirt. The barber dips his cloth in wine and presses it to her mouth, and then with the crowd watching, the iron enters her mouth. A scream, a twist, a tooth in the air held high like a prize. The crowd claps. The girl cries. The barber bows. This was medicine in the Middle Ages, not behind closed doors, not cloaked in silence, but performed like theater, public, raw, and unforgettable. By the late medieval period, some barbers began forming guilds, hoping to standardize and legitimize their practice. In places like France and England, barber surgeons gained official recognition. Some even received training from universities. Rare, but not unheard of. But dentistry remained on the fringe. Always painful, always imprecise, always just a little terrifying. And so the barbershop remained what it had always been, a place where the line between healing and harm was razor thin, where blood flowed alongside conversation, where relief came at a cost, and where in the corner the tooth key always waited. Let's dim the torchlight just a little, lower the volume of the marketplace outside. We're going to take a slow, quiet look at the tools, the real iron and wood companions of the medieval dentist. No magic, no mystery, just cold metal splintered, wood and centuries of pain. And at the center of it all, the tooth key. It sounds harmless enough, almost quaint, like something a child might play with in a fairy tale. But in truth, it's one of the most feared instruments in dental history. The tooth key, or key of Guérin, as it was sometimes called, was a grim little device that looked disturbingly like something you might use to fix a wagon wheel rather than a person's mouth. Picture a short iron shaft with a curved hook-like claw at one end and a wooden handle on the other. It was called a key because it worked on the same principle as turning a key in a lock, except instead of opening a door, it twisted a tooth right out of your jaw. Here's how it worked. The patient, usually sitting, sometimes standing, rarely lying down, would open their mouth wide. The barber or surgeon would place the claw of the key around the base of the tooth, usually under the gum line. Then with a firm grip, they would twist the tool, rotating the tooth until it popped free from the socket. In theory, it was fast. In practice, it was brutal. Teeth often broke mid-extraction. Roots snapped, gums tore. Sometimes the key slipped and shattered adjacent teeth, and sometimes the patient would jerk their head mid-turn, leading to catastrophic injuries, not just to the mouth, but to the jawbone itself. Some variations of the tool included a stop or a padded disc that pressed against the other teeth to provide leverage. Others were completely unrefined, just a bare hook and a prayer. And yet this instrument was a staple in the medieval dental toolkit for centuries. But the tooth key wasn't alone. Oh no, it had a whole cabinet of companions, each one more unsettling than the last. There were dental pelicans named for the bird because of their beak-like shape. These had a hooked beak on one end and a handle on the other. They worked on a similar principle: grip, wedge, and pry. But the pelican was arguably even more dangerous if misused, which was often it could crush the tooth or crack the jaw. And without proper technique, it tended to gouge the gums wide open. And they were forceps the simplest, and arguably most effective of all the tools. Just two arms curved, grip the tooth, and yank it out. But in the medieval world, forceps were always uniform. Some were too small, others too large. Many were repurposed from blacksmith tools or made by local ironmongers with no medical training whatsoever. Imagine someone trying to pull out a splinter with fireplace tongs. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. And don't forget the chisels and mallets. When a tooth couldn't be pulled, or when it had decayed to the point of being brittle or fused to the bone, some practitioners simply chiseled it out. This meant cracking the tooth, splintering it piece by piece, and scooping out the fragments. This wasn't dentistry. This was demolition. Gums bled profusely. Bone fragments were sometimes left behind. Infections were common, and the noise alone, the tap-tap of a mallet against the chisel, could cause panic in other patients waiting their turn. And then there were scaling tools, tiny, sharp hooks used to scrape plaque and tartar from the teeth and below the gum line. These were rare in early medieval dentistry, but by the later Middle Ages, they began to appear among the wealthier classes. Not because anyone particularly cared about oral health, but because clean teeth were a mark of status. Poor people got extractions. The rich got scrapes and polishes. Different methods, same tools, same pain. What's perhaps most disturbing is how casual this all was. Tools were rarely cleaned between uses. There was no concept of sterilization. Blood would dry on the metal. Pieces of old teeth might still cling to the forceps. A barber might wipe them off with a dirty cloth, if he bothered at all, before moving on to the next patient. Infections followed, of course, the mouth with its delicate tissues. And constant moisture is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. After a rough extraction, patients often developed abscesses, fevers, or worse, osteomyelitis, a dangerous infection of the jawbone. But even if infection didn't take hold, the trauma often left permanent scars. Teeth didn't always come out cleanly. Gums could recede, adjacent teeth might loosen, jaw alignment might change. And for some, especially older patients, the shock of the procedure could lead to complications far beyond the mouth. Still, these tools remained because they were all anyone had. For many medieval practitioners, the tools were an extension of themselves, passed down from master to apprentice, sharpened by hand, repaired with string or wire, tucked into leather satchels, or laid out on wooden tables like sacred relics. There was a strange kind of pride in them, not in a malicious way, not in cruelty, but in craft. A barber might take great care, sharpening his tooth key, adjusting the curve, reinforcing the handle. Not because he enjoyed the pain it caused, but because it was his trade, his tool, his livelihood. In fact, some barbers even decorated their instruments. Inscriptions, carvings, painted initials. It was as if in a world full of suffering they needed to believe their tools could still be beautiful. It's tempting to look back and judge them harshly, to recoil from the crude implements and the agonizing procedures. But in truth, these tools were born from necessity, from desperation, from the eternal human need to ease pain, even when the cure was nearly as bad as the disease. So the next time you walk into a modern dental office, take a moment to appreciate the silence, the gleaming instruments, the numbing gels, the gentle hum of technology. Because once, not so long ago, it was different. Once, it was a room with no light but the fire, no sound but the screen, no tools but iron and hope. In the corner, sitting quietly, the tooth key waited. Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe slowly now. Imagine the soft swelling under your jaw, a dull ache behind your molars, a heat beginning to rise in your gums. The pain isn't sharp out yet, but it's growing deep rhythmic pulsing with every heartbeat. This is not a simple toothache. This is an abscess, a slow building storm beneath the skin, and in the medieval world, this could kill you. In today's world, we tend to think of dental issues as minor inconveniences: cavity, fillet gum swelling, rinse and rest tooth infection. A round of antibiotics and you're fine. But in the Middle Ages, the simplest dental infections could spiral into catastrophic abscesses, or infections that form a pocket of pus, usually around the root of a tooth or in the surrounding gum. They might start from a small cavity or a piece of food, trapped too long between the teeth. But without cleaning, without brushing, without anything remotely resembling modern hygiene, abscesses were common. In fact, they were expected, and medieval people knew what they meant. They called them tooth swellings or face boils, and they feared them because once an abscess set in, it wasn't just a matter of pain, it was a matter of time. As the infection deepened, the face would swell lopsided and puffy, sometimes grotesquely, so the area around the jaw might grow hot, red, and tender to the touch. Swallowing could become difficult. Speaking might turn into a muffled mumble, and the pain, throbbing inescapable, a dull roar that refused to quiet day or night. Some turned to folk remedies, poultices of onion or garlic, boiled herbs pressed against the cheek, warm wine rinses, compresses of sheep's wool dipped in vinegar. Others would visit the local barber surgeon and beg for a lancing, hoping the pus could be drained before it spread. But the danger was not just in the tooth itself. It was in where the infection could go if the pus had nowhere to drain. It could burrow deeper into the jawbone, the throat, or the bloodstream. It could lead to osteomyelitis, a bone infection that caused swelling, fever, and the eventual decay of the jaw. Or worse, Ludwig's angina, a terrifying condition where the tissues under the tongue swell so severely that the airway becomes blocked, suffocation from a tooth infection. It sounds impossible, but it happened, and it happened often. Some people's abscesses would rupture naturally, draining through the yowl, gums, or cheek. Others might carry the swelling for weeks, even months, before it exploded in a wave of pain and pus. Those lucky enough to survive were often left disfigured, sunken cheeks, rotten gaps, jaws that no longer aligned. In rural areas, with no access to trained help, people often turned to rituals. One popular method was the toothworm cure. Since many believed cavities and abscesses were caused by small worms gnawing at the roots of teeth, local healers would burn herbs that produced smoke and blow it into the mouth, hoping to smoke out worms. Some used iron nails, pressed to the gums while reciting prayers or spells. Others drank mixtures of crushed mint, vinegar, and chalk, less for the infection, more for the hope. And when the pain grew too much to bear, then came the extractions, violent, messy, uncertain. But here's the twist. Sometimes, even pulling the tooth didn't help. If the infection had spread to the jaw or the bloodstream, the tooth was no longer the problem. It was just a marker, a warning. The real threat had already taken root inside the body. Some wealthy individuals, aware of these dangers, began to take primitive steps toward prevention, chewing herbs like cloves or anise, using small sticks called chew sticks to scrub the teeth. Some even imported powders from the Islamic world, where dentistry was more advanced. But these were luxuries. The average villager had no such resources. Instead, they relied on luck and time. If an abscess drained, they survived. If not, they faded slowly and painfully. Graveyards from the medieval period tell the silent story. Skulls with open, infected sockets, jaws with eroded bone teeth, with gaping cavities that bore through the enamel like tunnels, signs of chronic infection. And sometimes, signs of healing. Proof that people endured this pain for months or years before death. Can you imagine? Waking each day with that kind of agony? Knowing it wouldn't go away? Not until the tooth was pulled, or you were the truly grim part? These infections didn't always stop at one tooth. If your diet was poor, and it often was, multiple abscesses might form. Entire rows of teeth would rot simultaneously. The body's immune system, already weak from malnutrition, couldn't keep up. Infections compounded, and one bad molar might turn into 4, then 8, then a full mouth of decay. And through it all, the pain was constant. No numbing gel, no aspirin, just wool soaked in wine, or a scream into your sleeve. There were even records of self-extractions. Desperate individuals yanking their own teeth out with pliers or knives, hoping to find relief in the pain. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. But it was a choice: act or suffer. The psychological toll can't be overstated. Pain like this changes a person. It turns speech into silence, food into fear, sleep into torment, and yet people lived. They adapted. They found small comforts: a hot stone pressed to the cheek, a prayer whispered in the dark. A neighbor who'd been through it before and knew how to help. Some towns even had unofficial tooth men, not trained barbers, not doctors, just locals who had pulled so many teeth in their lifetime that others began to come to them for help. Their homes smelled of herbs and blood. Their tools were passed from hand to hand, but their knowledge, however, crude, meant survival in a way. Dental pain was a kind of shared language. Everyone knew it, everyone feared it, and everyone, at some point, would feel it. So, next time you feel the faintest ache in your tooth, and schedule a quick appointment. Take a moment to remember the swelling faces, the lancing blades, the sleepless nights, the quiet prayers by the fire, because once, not so long ago, a toothache was more than pain. It was a trial, a test, and for some, a death sentence in disguise. Take a deep breath, exhale slowly. Now imagine a wooden table worn smooth by decades of use. Laid out upon it are not instruments of healing, but implements of necessity. Iron pliers rusted at the hinge, bone-handled knives, hooks, spikes, and metal. Rods, some of them more suitable for a torture chamber than a dental visit. Welcome to the medieval dentistry toolkit. These tools were often crude, unrefined, hand-forged by blacksmiths, who also made horseshoes and swords, but they were what people had, and they were used with the same intent as today's sleek modern instruments: to stop pain, to save lives, or at the very least, to end the suffering. Let's begin with one of the most feared, the pelican. It wasn't shaped like a bird, though. It borrowed its name from one. The dental pelican had a curved beak-like arm and a long handle. The curved end was placed around the base of a tooth, often a molar, and then with one brutal twist of the wrist, it would wrench the tooth from the hole. Gum, sometimes cleanly, more often not. The pelican could cause the tooth to snap, leaving the root embedded. It could shatter neighboring teeth. It might crack the jaw if applied with too much force, but despite its risks, it remained in use for centuries. Then there was the tooth key, a later invention, but one that still found its way into early medieval practice in some form. The tooth key looked like a door key with a claw on the end. It would be inserted into the mouth, the claw positioned around the tooth, and then twisted like turning a lock. The problem: if the tooth didn't come out immediately, the twisting could tear the gum, splinter the tooth, or break the bone. Imagine lying back, no anesthetic, no numbing agent, as a man with soot under his nails grips your head and begins to twist a piece of iron against your jaw. That was the reality. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it made things worse. The barber surgeons who used these tools were not trained in any modern sense. Their instruction came from observation, repetition, and tradition. A young apprentice might learn to pull teeth by watching his master perform it in the back of a shop or on a roadside stool. There were no charts, no diagrams, just instinct and experience. they did there. Work quickly, because speed was all they had. Then came the scrapers and chisels, used for removing decayed tissue, cleaning abscesses, or when desperate chipping away bone to relieve pressure. These tools had blunt ends or rough edges. They were inserted into open wounds or under the gum line. No gloves, no sterilization, just pressure and willpower. And the patient, they gripped whatever they could. A piece of leather, a friend's hand, their own teeth. There were also tools designed for burning, and cauterizing small metal rods that could be heated in a fire that applied to infected areas. This wasn't dentistry in the way we think of it. It was damage control. Cauterization killed infection. Yes, but it also killed tissue nerves, and sometimes hope. And of course, the simplest and most common of all tools, the tongs were used for everything, from pulling splinters to extracting nails from carts. But when no pelican or tooth key was available, tongs became the last resort. Wide and unforgiving, they were gripped by strong hands and clamped down on the offending tooth. Then pull, twist, yank, repeat. There were no dental chairs. Patients might sit on barrel stools or even stand leaning back against a wall. Assistants, or sometimes just sympathetic bystanders, would hold their arms, shoulders, or jaw steady. The goal was to keep the head still, even as the pain made them squirm. The most unsettling thing, some of these tools worked, not because they were well designed, but because teeth once loosened from their sockets don't hold on for long. What followed extraction was just as brutal. With an open bleeding wound, there was always risk of infection. Sometimes hot wine or brine was poured over the gums to cleanse the area. Sometimes honey was applied, one of the only substances known to inhibit bacterial growth. But most often the patient was simply told to rinse with water and rest. No stitches, no follow-up, just healing by nature's grace, or not at all. Not every dental tool was made of iron in rural villages. Makeshift tools were often carved from wood or bone. Small sticks shaped into prying tools. Animal ribs fashioned into scrapers' fishing line used to wrap around a loose tooth tied to a door. And slammed shut stories of such methods exist across cultures from Europe to Asia. Some tools were used only in rituals. A tooth hammer, often nothing more than a small carved mallet, might be tapped gently against the cheek while chanting invocations, meant to drive out evil spirits. Others believed that certain stones, if rubbed on the gums, could draw out the pain. Obsidian, hematite, or amberphor. Some the tool wasn't even needed, just a pair of strong hands, a solid grip, and a moment of determination. Parents would pull the teeth of their children. Husbands would pull the teeth of their wives. And in dark corners of candlelit cottages, the screams would echo, not in cruelty, but in love, in survival. The grim beauty of this era is not in the tools themselves, but in the persistence of the people who used them, to endure pain, to face it with grit, to help one another when there was no one else. Some of these ancient tools still survive, preserved in museums, resting in drawers, curved, rusted, silent. If you look closely, you might see the wear marks from countless extractions. The grooves etched by time and use. They are quiet reminders, not just of pain, but of courage. And as you drift now, eyes heavy, imagining the clink of metal in a stone-walled room, soft hiss of a fire warming an iron rod, and the whispered prayer of someone hoping this time it works. Remember, the past was not sterile. It was not gentle, but it was deeply, profoundly human. And behind every tool, there was a story of need, of fear, and of someone somewhere hoping for relief. Let your body soften. Let the quiet deepen. And now picture this. A candlelit room in a stone cottage. A child holds their cheek, tears streaking down a dirt-smudged face. Their jaw is swollen. The tooth is black at the base. They don't know the words infection or abscess, but they know pain and they know fear. Tonight, we sink gently into the medieval mind, into how people understood tooth decay, and the strange, often poetic explanations they offered for something So painful, yet so common to begin with. Let's talk about the toothworm. Yes, that's right. Many people in the Middle Ages believed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms burrowing inside their teeth. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was widely accepted throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with roots in ancient Babylonian texts, and honestly, if you didn't have a microscope and your molars suddenly cracked and crumbled apart, it might make sense. Idea was that these worms fed on the food you ate, lived inside the hollow of your tooth, and when they moved or died, they caused pain. Some claim to have seen the worms during extractions, soft black specks wriggling in the cavity. But these were more likely bits of nerve tissue or pulp, mistaken for living creatures. The worm theory persisted for centuries, sometimes even backed by physicians who should have known better to treat it. Well, there were many methods. One popular option was fumigation, a clove of garlic or a mix of crushed henbane seeds and sheep fat would be heated until it smoked. The smoke was then funneled into the mouth, sometimes with a hollow reed, sometimes just from close proximity. The idea was simple: smoke out the worm, and while it didn't do much for the decay, it occasionally dulled the pain. Not because the worm was gone, but because henbane contains powerful psychoactive compounds it might not cure the ache, but it would certainly make your head float. Other people believed that decay came from imbalances within the body, part of the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine. Too much black bile, you might develop tooth rot. Too much phlegm, your breath would turn sour. The solution wasn't in the tooth. It was in your diet, your lifestyle, your moods. You'd be prescribed herbal teas, purging agents, or even leeches to balance your internal humors. And then there were those who believed it was a curse. Toothaches were sometimes thought to be punishment, either for sin or for failing to honor certain saints. In Germany and parts of France, it was said that if you didn't pray to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, you might be struck with sudden unbearable tooth pain. Apollonia herself was martyred by having her teeth violently pulled out. So naturally, sufferers invoked her name. During moments of agony, they clutched pendants, whispered prayers, and sometimes even made small offerings at roadside shrines. Pain was not just physical, it was spiritual. What did people do before the tooth reached the point of extraction? Let's imagine you're a peasant. In the 14th century, you've begun to notice a dull ache in your lower jaw. A back molar has gone soft. There's a bad taste in your mouth. You don't have access to a barber surgeon. You can't afford prayers at a cathedral, so you do what you can. You might chew on willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the chemical precursor to aspirin. You might press cloves into the gum, hoping their oils would numb the nerve. You might ask the village wise woman for a salve, perhaps something with honey sage or vinegar. And at night, when the pain became unbearable, you tie a rag around your head and lie still, waiting for the ache to fade with sleep. If it ever did, tooth decay was more than an inconvenience. It was a life-altering condition. A rotting tooth could lead to chronic infection, swelling, fever, and on rare but real occasions, death. When abscesses formed, they could spread to the jaw, the neck, even the brain. People didn't always understand the cause, but they knew the danger. This is why preventive rituals emerged, blending superstition and practicalities. Families burned the milk teeth of their children to prevent evil spirits from using them in curses, saved them in small cloth pouches, and buried them near the home to keep the child's strength close to the earth. German tradition said that if you swallowed your baby tooth after it fell out, a strong, healthy adult tooth would grow in its place. Other beliefs were stranger still, like rubbing a dog's tooth against your own to transfer the pain away. Even royalty participated in this magical thinking. Kings and queens, though surrounded by physicians, would carry tooth amulets fashioned from coral, ivory, or even tiny bits of silver shaped into crosses. Then there was the toothache charm, a written spell or prayer They would be folded and worn inside clothing, or placed under the pillow. Some were purely religious, invocations of saints, verses from the Psalms. Others were less so, scrambled words, symbols, fragments of older pagan chants. The line between medicine and magic was blurry, woven together by the shared desperation for relief, and all the while, the decay marched on unseen, unstoppable. What's remarkable, perhaps, is not the failure of medieval dentistry, but its creativity in the face of limited understanding, with no microscopes, no bacteria theory, and no anesthesia. People still tried to explain and endure something as painful and personal as tooth rot. In some ways, their instincts weren't far off. They knew that certain herbs eased pain. They noticed that stress bad food, and injury made things worse. They recognized that oral health mattered not just for the mouth, but for the whole body. They may have called it worms. They may have blamed the moon, or the devil, or their neighbor's evil eye. But what they were describing was something very real, the slow, steady erosion of one of the body's most vital systems. As you breathe now, calm and slow, let your thoughts drift back to that dim cottage, to the child with the aching jaw, to the mother who doesn't understand why it happened, but who holds her child anyway. Because sometimes there are no answers, only comfort, only presence, and the belief, no matter how flawed, that something can still be done. Let the stillness settle again. You're drifting gently now into a space between professions, where grooming met surgery, and where the medieval barber was as likely to cut your hair as your aching tooth. Tonight, we meet the barber surgeons, the unlikely figures who stood between everyday pain and primitive healing, part barber, part butcher, part healer, and very much the medieval answer to a missing dental profession. Let us step into a small town somewhere in 14th century England. The marketplace is busy. Horses clop down muddy streets. Vendors shout the prices of bread and salted meat. And just off the square, in a narrow wooden shop, hangs a pole painted red and white, that familiar spiral we still see today. It began here. The red for blood, the white for bandages. The pole itself represented the staff a patient might grip while enduring a painful procedure, something to hold on to when there was no anesthesia to dull the blade. Inside this shop, past the razor strops and shaving bowls, stood the barber surgeon's chair. This man, usually a man, was not trained in a university. He had no Latin texts, no inked diplomas. What he had was experience passed down from a master, often through apprenticeship. He might have spent years watching others pull teeth, lance boils, set broken bones, and eventually he'd be trusted to do it himself. And in the absence of physicians, who were few and expensive, it was the barber surgeon who served the people he shaved their beards, he cut their hair, and when needed, he pulled their teeth. Tooth extraction was one of his most dreaded services, both for patient and practitioner. There were no appointments, no sterile tools. You might simply walk in clutching your jaw, moaning from a night without sleep, and beg to have the tooth removed. The barber surgeon would inspect the mouth, perhaps using a candle for light, and decide which tooth to pull. Accuracy was difficult. Gums were swollen, teeth were layered. Typically mistakes happened, and once he made his choice, there was no going back. Let's talk about the tools, Chief. Among them was the dental pelican, an early extraction device used from the 14th to 18th century. It resembled the beak of a pelican, with a curved hook on one side and a flat brace on the other. The hook was wedged between the tooth and the gum, the brace pressed against the jaw. Then came the motion, sharp, brutal, and swift. A twist, a yank, and sometimes a scream. The pelican failed. The tooth key might be used instead. It looked like an old door key with a claw at the end. A barber would set the claw around the base of the tooth, twist the instrument like turning a lock, and if all went well, snap the tooth free. But all didn't always go well. Teeth broke mid-pull, roots shattered and stayed buried. Gums bled freely. Infections followed. The pain was immense. no numbing, no sedation. Sometimes the barber offered wine or ale beforehand. Other times he'd instruct the patient to bite down on leather, and always he worked quickly, because he knew the faster it ended, the more likely his patient would survive it. Despite the danger, people came, not because they trusted the barber surgeon completely, but because there was no one else in villages without doctors or monks. The barber was the only option. And while some botched their work or caused injury, many others learned to develop a surprisingly deft hand. They learned which angle gave the cleanest pull, which herbs might slow bleeding, which mouth rinses soothed pain afterward like salt vinegar or sage infusions. In time, barber surgeons became fixtures of the community. People whispered about the good ones, avoided the bad, and lived in hope that they'd never need their services now. Let's linger for a moment in the emotional world of the barber surgeon. He wasn't simply a tradesman. He was a man who witnessed pain every day. He held shaking hands. He saw blood in the beard of young boys. He watched mothers weep for children whose infections had spread too far. And he knew that what he offered wasn't perfection. It was relief, brutal, imperfect relief. Some barber surgeons developed something close to pride. They might hang pulled teeth in jars by the door, trophies of their trade. Others became solemn and quiet over time, dulled by the toll of suffering. But all of them shared something vital, a role in the long, slow evolution of dentistry. Because eventually, people began to notice some barbers were better at extractions than others. Some seemed to understand the mouth better, knew how to clean, how to treat rot early, how to soothe swollen gums, and slowly across the centuries, a separation occurred. The barber surgeon began to split into two paths, one continuing with general medical procedures, and the other focusing on the teeth. By the 17th century, especially in urban areas, a new word began to emerge: dentist. No longer just a barber. Not quite a surgeon, something new. But that change hadn't come yet in the time we're exploring tonight. No, in our world, this sleepy candlelit medieval town, the barber still reigns. And across the continent, men with razors and iron tools are pulling teeth, wrapping wounds, and doing the best they can with what little they know. So if you're lying in the dark, listening now, picture the gentle sound of wet stone on steel, the flicker of lamplight on polished iron, the scent of rosemary. Steeping in a wooden bowl meant to cleanse the mouth, or perhaps just ease the air, and the barber quiet, wiping his hands, waiting for the next knock on the door. He won't ask many questions. He won't have many answers, but he will help. And in a world with few options, that is enough. Settle in, the fire is low, and the wind outside carries the faint smell of smoke and soil. Tonight we wander not through surgical chambers or candlelit barbershops, but through the mystical and mysterious world of medieval cures, where toothaches weren't just pains of the body, but signs of spiritual imbalance, divine punishment, or unseen curses. This was a time when science and superstition mingled freely, when monks copied ancient Greek texts in cloisters by day, and villagers whispered spells to cure tooth rot by night. Because when it came to dental pain, people would try almost anything. Let's begin with herbal remedies, the most accessible form of relief. Many people didn't have access to a barber surgeon, let alone a trained physician, so they turned to the plants that grew near their homes. Cloves, for example, weren't just a sweet-smelling spice. They were valued for their numbing properties. A clove might be tucked directly beside a rotting tooth, releasing its oil. Slowly, willow bark was another favorite, chewed raw or brewed into tea. It contained salicin, the same compound that would centuries later inspire the creation of aspirin. Yarrow, sage, mint, and chamomile were all used in some form, gargled, mashed, poulticed, depending on the healer's instructions and the patient's desperation. But beyond herbs lay stranger treatments, hot irons for one. Some folk healers believed that heat could draw out the evil. This meant taking a slender piece of metal, usually iron, and heating it in the fire until it glowed. Then with trembling hands, they'd hold it near the cheek of the afflicted, or even closer. Sometimes too close. There were tales of skin burns, even jaw damage. But for some, it was a risk worth taking. If the pain stopped even for a moment, it was worth it. Then came the rituals. In parts of rural Europe, toothache wasn't just an illness. It was seen as a curse, something brought on by breaking a taboo, angering a spirit, or neglecting a sacred duty. So people turned to magic. One remedy involved catching a toad, yes, a toad, and placing it in the mouth, briefly believing it would absorb the pain. Others involved writing prayers on parchment and tying them around the jaw. Some people whispered charms over a bowl of water and used it to rinse their mouths, believing the words, not the water, held the power there. There's even a record of a 13th century German charm that went like this: toothworm, toothworm, flee with haste into the field to the beast you taste. The belief here was that tiny worms caused tooth decay, a theory that, oddly enough, wasn't entirely wrong. People had noticed thin white threads or worms in decayed teeth, likely nerve tissue or fungal growth, and so they imagined tiny creatures gnawing from within. Chants like this one were meant to banish the monks, though more grounded, weren't above mixing faith with folklore. Some religious texts recommended praying to specific saints for relief. Saint Apollonia, for example, was the patron saint of dentistry. According to legend, her teeth were violently pulled out during a Roman persecution of Christians. After her death, she was venerated by those suffering tooth pain. People would pray to her, light candles in her name, and sometimes carry small tokens bearing her image, hoping she would ease their suffering from above. In more learned circles, particularly among the educated physicians of the Islamic world and early universities, treatments became more refined, though still strange to modern eyes. Some recommended rinses made from boiled vinegar, crushed onions, and goat fat. Others mixed ox bile with wine and instructed patients to swish it around the mouth, and a few even suggested wrapping leeches around the gums to draw out bad blood. Each remedy had its own logic, its own story, its own blend of hope and hazard, and yet no matter the remedy, one truth remained: pain was constant. These treatments were not cures. They were moments of relief, short respites, acts of desperation in a world without Novocaine or modern hygiene, and still people kept trying. Imagine now a small cottage at dusk. The healer, a woman gray-haired with fingers stained from herbs, sits before a child who won't stop crying. A child's cheek is swollen, feverish, the tooth is clearly infected. The healer chants softly in a language older than Latin, dips her fingers in warm honey and sage, and applies the mixture gently along the gum line. The child quiets, not because the pain is gone, but because someone is trying in a world of crude tools and terrifying remedies. Compassion was sometimes the only anesthetic available. Or picture a weary traveler arriving in a town just as night falls. He's heard of a monk who lives by the river, known for easing pain with prayers and strange salts. The man knocks. He's let in a poultice, is prepared vinegar, myrrh, garlic. The monk binds it against the aching tooth and murmurs the name of Saint Apollonia under his breath. Does it work? Who's to say? But the pain softens long enough for the traveler to sleep. Sleep in these stories is often the real goal, because medieval people didn't expect complete cures. They didn't dream of clean fillings, sterile drills, or perfect white smiles. They wanted sleep, a night without pain, a moment of peace, and for that, they'd try anything. So, as you drift tonight, let these images settle softly in your mind. The flicker of candlelight on drying herbs, whispered charm in the corner of a silent hut, a steaming bowl of clove water, a hand resting gently on a fevered brow, and the promise not of healing, but of effort, of care. Because even in the harshest times, even in the face of pain, people reached for each other and tried. Let's take one last deep breath. You've traveled far tonight through smoky apothecaries, bloodied workshops, and quiet corners of folk magic. We've walked side by side with the tooth pullers, the charm whisperers, and the herbal caretakers. And now, here at the final chapter, we look not backward, but forward through the long shadow that medieval dentistry still casts across our lives today. Might seem strange, how could something as brutal and primitive as medieval dentistry leave a legacy? But it has, not just in the evolution of tools or in old superstitions, but in the very way we think about pain, about the body, and about trust. Let's begin where many stories still do today: fear of the dentist. The fear of dental work is one of the most common phobias in the modern world. And while today's clinics are brightly lit and sterile, with trained professionals and soft music playing, that anxiety often feels ancient, deep, primal. That's because it is. For centuries, going to the dentist was not a matter of mild discomfort. It was a gamble. A risk. The pain might be worse afterward, the bleeding might not stop, the wrong tooth might be pulled, and so the fear became generational, passed down in stories, embedded in language. Even today, phrases like ripping it out, like a bad tooth, or worse than pulling teeth, echo with the old memory of iron pincers, wooden chairs, and unwashed hands. The image of the barber surgeon, the itinerant tooth puller, the back alley healer, they all left a mark on how society perceived medicine itself. Trust in medical professionals had to be earned, painfully and slowly, and much of that skepticism still lingers even. Our modern dental tools are shaped literally and figuratively by medieval predecessors. The forceps, with their gripping beak-like design, evolved from the crude pliers used by blacksmiths turned surgeons. The dental drill, now fast and precise, has roots in the early hand crank devices used to scrape or bore into decayed enamel. Even the reclining dental chair, now cushioned and ergonomic, can trace its ancestry to the wooden benches where patients were pinned down by helpers. But it's not all horror and discomfort. What's remarkable is how humanity learned from those dark chapters. How every failure led to a small discovery. How pain led to innovation. In the 17th and 18th centuries, dentistry began to shift. French physician Pierre Fauchard, often called the father of modern dentistry, revolutionized the field with tools of his own design and a book filled with observations, not spells. He rejected barbaric methods. He understood the value of hygiene, and he brought science to a craft still tangled in folklore. But even Fauchard owed something to the medieval world. Its records, its observations, even its mistakes. The herbs once used by folk healers became subjects of chemical analysis. Clove oil, once tucked into rotten molars by peasants, is now an ingredient in modern dental anesthetics. The belief that tooth forms cause decay may sound silly today, but it reflects a natural attempt to explain the invisible, the microbial world. Long before it could be seen, even Saint Apollonia, patron of toothache sufferers, still finds her way into modern clinics in parts of Italy. Her image is placed near the front desk in other parts of the world. Dental associations still hold feast days in her honor, not because people expect divine healing, but because her story reminds us that pain and courage have always walked hand in hand. Then there's the deeper, more personal legacy, our relationship with pain itself. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of numbing gels or painkillers. They endured, they adapted, they sought comfort in community, in prayer, in potions. That resilience is something we still carry. When we face our own fears, when we sit back in a reclining chair and let a stranger work inside our mouths, we're drawing on centuries of silent bravery. And perhaps, more than anything, we've learned that health is not just about the body, it's about trust, belief, and care. It's about the quiet moments of humanity that existed even in the bloodiest, darkest corners of history. A barber wiping his hands before reaching for the pliers, a mother crushing sage into a poultice for her child, a monk reciting a prayer in the dim glow of a lantern. These were acts of hope, of love, of effort, however imperfect. And now, as you lie here in the stillness of this final chapter, think of those echoes, the silence of a medieval night, broken only by the soft rustle of straw underfoot, the crackle of a hearth in a stone cottage, the quiet breathing of someone waiting for pain to pass. Centuries have passed, but the story continues, and tonight, it ends not with a scream or a shudder, but with stillness, with reflection, with a gentle understanding that even in the harshest of times, people tried their best with what they had. They feared, they endured, they healed, and now, so can you let your thoughts drift like smoke from an old chimney. Let the images fade into the mist. Let the pain of the past become a lesson, not a weight, and let sleep carry you gently, far from pliers and poultices, into dreams where no teeth ache, no iron glows, and no midnight knock ever comes. Good night.